You know, I nearly lost my mind in that house once, said Oliver, sipping his coffee with a distant look in his eyes. His gaze wandered out the window as if the darkness beyond held fragments of his memories. What? In what house? Asked Mark, a young journalist, his interest piqued as he adjusted his recorder. His curiosity flared instantly, like a hunter catching a scent. That house at the edge of the woods, Oliver replied, his voice dropping a notch. The one no one's lived in for decades. Yeah, I'm the fool who tried to live there. Wait, you mean the House of Silence? The one people say swallows anyone who enters? I thought that was just a local legend. What were you doing there? Oliver smirked faintly, as if Mark's disbelief amused him. Looking for inspiration, as cliché as that sounds. Back then, I was a writer, barely. I thought the silence would help me find my voice again. Turned out, the silence had a voice of its own. Did it? Mark leaned forward, his excitement barely concealed. What happened? Patience, kid. Every story deserves its own time, Oliver replied, swirling the coffee in his cup. I'll say this much, what I found there made me believe every legend has a kernel of truth. Oliver needed to escape the city's noise, the relentless grind of a concrete jungle that was slowly consuming his soul. He believed silence could be his medicine. But when he first stepped across the threshold of the house, a chill settled deep in his chest. Something about the place felt wrong. The house stood like a forgotten relic, its walls cloaked in moss and its windows dimly reflecting the encroaching shadows of the forest. The air was dense, oppressive, carrying a faint metallic tang that made breathing feel heavy. Inside, the scent of dampness hung thick, mingling with the faint smell of something far older, like the echoes of lives long past clinging stubbornly to the walls. At first, I was thrilled, Oliver said, his tone tinged with irony. The house was quiet. Too quiet, like a grave. I thought I'd found the perfect place. But you know how life is, right? Just when you think you're in control, it flips the script on you, Mark chimed in. Exactly. The first days were peaceful. Oliver slept for the first time in months, relishing the stillness. He explored the house, noticing its peculiarities, the grandfather clock in the parlor that didn't tick, the rocking chair that seemed to wait for someone. He avoided the basement, why wouldn't he? But then the strangeness began. The clock, which had been silent, started ticking. Not steadily, though, its rhythm was jagged, like it couldn't decide whether to move forward or backward. And then came the silence, not the peaceful kind he had sought, but a smothering void that pressed against his chest like a weight. And the whispers, Oliver added, his voice barely above a murmur. That's when it really started. Mark's brow furrowed. Whispers? What whispers? At first, I thought it was the wind, Oliver continued. Soft, indistinct. But then it became clearer. They said my name. They told me to go somewhere. Go where? Mark's voice carried an edge of apprehension. Oliver's gaze locked onto his. The basement. That night, Oliver couldn't sleep. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. Oliver, beneath the roots, you must see, they pulled at him until he could no longer resist. He descended the creaking stairs, the basement door resisting him as though alive. When it finally gave way, a rush of cold air greeted him. What did you find? Mark asked, leaning forward, hanging on every word. At first, nothing, Oliver said. Just darkness. But it wasn't an ordinary darkness. It was alive. And it was watching me. His flashlight flickered, its weak beam casting fleeting light on strange symbols etched into the floor. They were burned into the stone, alien in their design. The house didn't want me there, Oliver said. It started to close in on me. The walls pulsed, the air grew heavier. It was like the house itself was alive and angry. Mark's throat felt dry, but he managed to croak, and you got out? Oliver leaned back, a wry smile playing on his lips. Barely. But let me give you some advice, kid. If you ever hear whispers calling your name, don't follow them. They don't forgive. Outside, the wind howled, and for a brief moment, Mark thought he heard a faint voice, whispering his name. "You ever hear the story about the Mirage cabin?" Nate asked, his voice low, almost conspiratorial. The firelight flickered against his weathered face, casting deep shadows that danced with the desert wind. "Mirage cabin?" Chloe repeated, raising an eyebrow as she adjusted her recorder. She was young, eager, and curious, the perfect mix for a journalist chasing stories on the road. "Sounds like one of those ghost stories truckers tell to keep each other awake." "What is it?" Nate chuckled dryly, poking at the fire with a stick. "Oh, it's a story, all right. But it ain't just for truckers. It's for anyone stupid enough to wander off the beaten path. Like me." Chloe leaned forward. "So, you've seen it?" "Seen it?" "I lived it," Nate said, his eyes narrowing as he stared into the flames. "You ready to hear it, kid?" "It ain't pretty. That's why I'm here," Chloe said with a grin. "Scare me." Nate wasn't much of a talker back then. He preferred the solitude of the open road, driving his battered pickup through stretches of desert that seemed to go on forever. It was on one of those drives, under a blistering sun that bleached the horizon, that he first saw it, a small cabin, perched atop a rocky outcrop. "Nothing unusual about it at first glance," Nate said, tossing a twig into the fire. "Just a plain wooden cabin, old and weathered, like it had been sitting there for decades. But something about it felt wrong." "What do you mean?" Chloe asked. "It was too still. No birds, no wind, not even the sound of the desert. Just silence. The cabin had no road leading to it, no signs of life around. Just sand, rock, and that eerie quiet." Curiosity got the better of Nate. He pulled over, grabbed his canteen, and started climbing the outcrop. "That's your first mistake," Chloe interjected, smirking. "Every horror movie starts with someone saying, 'I was curious.'" Nate grinned. "You're not wrong, kid. But what can I say? Curiosity's a hell of a thing." The climb was tougher than it looked. The rocks were sharp, the sun relentless, and by the time Nate reached the cabin, his shirt was soaked with sweat. Up close, the place was even stranger. The wood looked warped, like it had been twisted by some unseen force. The windows were too small, too high, and the door, well, it didn't seem to fit the frame quite right. "Did you go in?" Chloe asked, her voice hushed. "Course I did," Nate replied. "That's mistake number 2. Inside, the air was cool. Too cool. The kind of chill that crawls up your spine and makes your breath fog, even in the middle of the desert." The room was empty, save for a single chair and a cracked mirror hanging on the far wall. But it wasn't what he saw that bothered Nate. It was what he didn't see. "No footprints," he said, his voice dropping. "No dust, no cobwebs." It was like the place had been waiting for someone. Nate stepped closer to the mirror, his reflection staring back at him. At least, he thought it was his reflection. But then it smiled. "Wait, what?" Chloe gasped. "It smiled?" "Not just smiled," Nate said, his voice grim. "It spoke." "What did it say?" "You shouldn't be here," Nate mimicked, his voice low and raspy. "And I swear, Chloe, it wasn't just a voice. It was mine. Like I was talking to myself." He bolted, stumbling out of the cabin and down the rocks. But the desert wasn't the same. The sun was gone, replaced by a sky smeared with sickly green clouds. The sand beneath his boots shifted, almost like it was alive, pulling him back toward the cabin. "I ran for hours," Nate said, shaking his head. "At least, it felt like hours. But no matter how far I went, that damn cabin stayed in sight. Always there, on the horizon, like it was chasing me." "That's impossible," Chloe whispered, her fingers tight around the recorder. "You're telling me," Nate replied. "But the desert has its own rules. And I was breaking them." Eventually, he collapsed, his body giving out. When he woke up, he was lying beside his truck, the sun beating down as if nothing had happened. The cabin was gone, the outcrop just another pile of rocks. "So, what do you think happened?" Chloe asked, her voice shaky. Nate stared into the fire, his face unreadable. "I think the desert's alive. And sometimes, it doesn't want you there." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, just as Chloe reached to turn off the recorder, the wind picked up, carrying a faint whisper that sounded almost like laughter. "They always said New York never sleeps," Jack muttered, clutching the cold steel pole of the subway car. "But maybe that's because no one dares to dream down here." The faint hum of the subway echoed like a heartbeat through the deserted tunnels, each vibration rattling his nerves. Shadows flitted in the corners of his vision, but every time he turned, they melted into the grimy walls. Jack wasn't a man prone to fear. He'd worked security at some of the city's roughest neighborhoods. But this wasn't fear. It was something else. Something primal. And it all started with that damned train. Jack never planned to end up in the subway that night. His life had taken a nosedive, a messy divorce, a failed business, and mounting debts that left him working graveyard shifts to stay afloat. He'd convinced himself the isolation of the subway patrol was a small price to pay for peace. But peace, he soon realized, had no place underground. A week ago, he'd overheard a hushed conversation between two maintenance workers. "Track 9, one whispered. Always something off down there. The lights flicker, the train stall, and those sounds, like someone's breathing right behind you." Jack had laughed it off then. Ghost stories. Every old place had them. But now, as he stared down the dimly lit platform, those words gnawed at his confidence. It started with a sound. A faint, metallic screech that echoed down the tunnel. Jack checked his watch. 2:45 a.m. No trains were scheduled for hours. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped closer to the edge of the platform, peering into the yawning darkness. "Come on, Jack. It's just the old tracks settling," he muttered, but the words felt hollow. Then he saw it. A faint glow, not the steady beam of a train's headlights, but a pale, flickering light that danced like a flame. It moved closer, illuminating fragments of the tunnel walls, graffiti scrawls, rusting pipes, and something else. Symbols. Strange, looping patterns etched into the stone. They weren't there before. The light vanished. In its place, a cold breeze swept past him, carrying a faint whisper. "Not yet." Jack didn't sleep that morning. The whispers haunted him, replaying over and over. Not yet. The next night, he returned to the same platform. He told himself it was curiosity, but deep down, he knew it was more. He needed answers. At 3 a.m., the train arrived. Except it wasn't a train he'd ever seen. The cars were old, their exteriors streaked with grime and soot. The windows were opaque, reflecting only his pale, startled face. The doors hissed open. Empty. "No way," Jack whispered, his breath fogging in the cold air. He stepped on board, his boots echoing against the metal floor. The air inside was heavy, laced with a metallic tang that reminded him of rusted steel. He walked down the aisle, passing row after row of empty seats. Then, halfway through the second car, he froze. A man sat alone. His suit was impeccable, but his skin, pale as ash. He didn't look at Jack, his gaze fixed on the window. "You shouldn't have come," the man said, his voice low and gravelly. "What?" Jack stammered. "Who are you?" The man turned slowly, his eyes, dark, bottomless, locking onto Jack's. "This train, it only stops for those it's chosen. And once you're on, there's no getting off." The train lurched forward, throwing Jack off balance. The lights flickered, casting the man's face into sharp relief. "Where is this going?" Jack demanded, gripping the edge of a seat. The man smiled, a hollow, humorless grin. "Not where you think." Outside the windows, the tunnel blurred, the walls replaced by shifting images, a desolate forest, a crumbling cityscape, an ocean of black water. Jack's stomach churned as the train seemed to defy reality itself. "This isn't real," Jack muttered, his voice shaking. "This is some kind of nightmare." The man's laugh was dry and brittle. "Nightmares are kinder. Here, you face what you've buried." As if on cue, the lights flared, and Jack found himself alone. The man was gone, but his voice lingered. "Do you hear it yet?" The whispers returned, louder now, overlapping like a chorus. They spoke his name, called him forward. At the end of the car, the door creaked open, revealing nothing. Just a void, black and infinite. They found Jack 2 days later, wandering the subway tunnels, muttering incoherently. "Not yet," he repeated, his eyes wide and unseeing. The authorities chalked it up to exhaustion and stress. No one believed his story of the train that wasn't there. Jack quit his job, left the city, and disappeared from public view. But every so often, subway workers report seeing him, a lone figure standing on an empty platform, staring into the darkness, waiting for the next train. And sometimes, late at night, the sound of a train echoes through track 9. But when the workers check, there's nothing there. Only a faint whisper lingers in the air. "Not yet."